Have you ever been training jiu-jitsu and you have that one annoying partner and you just want to just... Well, now you can. Guys, this is Sean with PDMA, and today we're going to talk about Combat Jiu Jitsu. That's right, CJJ. And no, I did not say CJI, so all you people that like to comment that I talk about CJI too much, this is not the video for that. But I am probably going to say CJI a couple times when I mean to say CJJ in this video, so I'll try to put it in text on the screen if I screw up. But it's probably going to happen, so warning now. Now with that out of the way, what is CJJ? Well, as I said in the intro, it is jiu-jitsu, but you can smack people. Kinda. We're going to go over the rules in just a little bit, but if you're not familiar with CJJ, don't worry because you are not alone. And while this form of jiu-jitsu isn't exactly brand new or anything, I think it kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people. However, with the growing popularity of submission grappling and some of the bigger tournaments we're seeing drawing attention to the sport, I think more and more people are starting to talk about combat jiu-jitsu. Today, we're going to take a look at what separates combat jiu-jitsu from regular jiu-jitsu. We're going to take a little bit of a look at the history of combat jiu-jitsu, and we're going to take a look at the future, because at the time of recording this video, there's actually like some really, really big combat jiu-jitsu tournaments like all happening in the same weekend in a few weeks from now. So we're going to cover that, as well as some of the rules and kind of what made modern combat jiu-jitsu what it is today. So in its simplest terms, combat jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu with palm strikes. You can think of it just like that if you're not familiar with it. Now, what separates combat jiu-jitsu from standard jiu-jitsu and what separates combat jiu-jitsu from MMA? Unlike normal jiu-jitsu, as I said, you can palm strike your opponent, but unlike MMA, that's the only strike that's legal. And it's actually not even legal at all times. In combat jiu-jitsu, the opponent has to be grounded in order for you to hit them with a palm strike. When both competitors are standing, you cannot throw any type of strikes. Obviously, no kicks are allowed at any time, but when opponent is grounded, you can strike them. Now, that's really the only major difference between this and standard submission grappling or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The tournaments tend to follow an EBI rule set, which includes EBI overtime. And for the most part, especially in like the CJI worlds and stuff, the official rules do call for an overtime that you cannot strike in. So that's interesting. I think sometimes when people are watching, they get a little confused when it goes into overtime. So keep that in mind if you're going to be watching any CJJ soon, that in overtime, most of the time, strikes are actually not allowed. And now that we know what combat jiu-jitsu is, let's take a look back and see how we got to where modern combat jiu-jitsu is today. So the first combat jiu-jitsu match actually happened a lot earlier than I think a lot of people realize. The first match actually took place on February 6th, 2012, and featured 10th Planet Black Belt Eric Cruz versus King's MMA Black Belt Christopher Gonzalez. Now, the rules were actually a little bit different than the ones I just described back then. Now, the rules are similar, but two noticeable differences you'll see in this first combat jiu-jitsu match are that one, it actually takes place in a cage just like an MMA fight, and two, also like an MMA fight, they're wearing 4-ounce gloves. Other than that, though, the match actually played out like a modern combat jiu-jitsu match, and I think is a really good match to watch if you want to understand the foundation of combat jiu-jitsu. So Eric Cruz, the 10th Planet Black Belt, did end up winning via rear naked choke, and I think that's important to note here, that Eric was a 10th Planet Black Belt. Now, if you've watched combat jiu-jitsu before, you know a lot of the top players in the sport have traditionally been 10th Planet guys, kind of up until very recently, and there's a reason for that. And that reason is Eddie Bravo started this. As we'll go on to talk about, these combat jiu-jitsu tournaments actually really kind of got started in the EBI tournaments, and Eddie Bravo is really the person who's credited with coming up with the idea for combat jiu-jitsu in the first place. Now, speaking of EBI, at EBI 11, we saw the first combat jiu-jitsu tournament take place. Now, before this tournament, I just want to back it up a little bit. The reason this happened at EBI 11 is because you have to take yourself back to this time period. And for a lot of us, that won't be too hard because it wasn't that long ago, but this was 2017. And what were we seeing in 2017 that we hadn't really seen for most of jiu-jitsu history? Leg locks. And Eddie Bravo at the time was very vocal about the fact that, yes, leg locks are a very good thing for the sport. We should have leg locks. But people weren't really figuring out kind of how to defend the leg locks, and leg locks were almost like a cheat code. If you were good at legs, most other people weren't. So what Eddie said was, well, I want to give the person who's not good at leg locks an advantage. While the systems are developing, as we know now, kind of with hindsight, we knew that systems for defense were developing for these leg locks, but at the time, I mean, nobody was really defending them all that well. And Eddie thought that throwing palm strikes in would be a really good equalizer against these leg lock guys, especially because, and if you play a lot of leg locks, you know this, when you're in a leg lock position, you might be able to keep people away from you for a certain amount of time, but there's a reason we don't see a ton of leg locks in MMA, because you are very vulnerable to getting punched in the face, or in this case, getting slapped in the face. And, spoiler alert, if that's never happened to you, that's not fun. And so since then, we've basically seen like yearly Combat Jiu Jitsu tournaments. There's the creation of the Combat Jiu Jitsu Worlds, of course, and then the creation of leagues like Medusa, which is an all-female CJJ league. But I think this actually kind of begs the question, why don't we see more Combat Jiu Jitsu? We see a lot of local MMA. We see a ton of local Jiu Jitsu these days. Why isn't there a lot of local Combat Jiu Jitsu? And if you search around for this on the internet, in my experience, you really don't find a great answer. So I went ahead and talked to some people that are kind of involved in CJJ, also involved in creating Brazilian Jiu Jitsu tournaments, some MMA organizers, and kind of got an idea of why this isn't more popular at the local level. And the first reason actually makes like a lot of sense if you think about it. And this came up over and over again when I spoke with people who are a little more involved in the Combat Jiu Jitsu world. And that's that because of the palm strikes in Combat Jiu Jitsu, most states actually require the State Athletic Commission to approve these bouts. Now, at best, you have to deal with a bunch of political red tape, and at worst, you're spending a lot of money to get something approved. And when it's something that's not that popular that you don't know can generate revenue, it just doesn't make a lot of sense for your local gym or your local organization to host a CJJ tournament. And now the next reason I think is because the biggest names in our sport are all competing in regular standard submission grappling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, whatever you want to call it. They're not competing in CJJ, so it makes CJJ a little more niche of a sport. So it's kind of like, if you think about it, it's a niche sport within an already niche sport. And because of that, I think the participation in it, the numbers just aren't super high. I mean, when was the last time you did CJJ rounds at your gym, unless you have somebody there who is training for a CJJ match kind of at a high level? And just to hone this point in a little further, if you look at the most successful people in our sport, and I'm just talking by the numbers here, people that have a lot of eyeballs on them, the Nicky Rods of the world, the Gordon Ryans of the world, the Craig Joneses of the world, the people that, even if you're not like fully invested in submission grappling and, you don't know every single competitor, but you're kind of interested, you probably know these guys. Well, these guys are all kind of making a pretty good living doing standard jiu-jitsu. So if you're newer coming into the sport, you are kind of looking for the path to do what they're doing. And obviously that's not to say that there hasn't been anybody successful who's ever done Combat Jiu-Jitsu. Obviously, Cade Rutolo had a beautiful buggy choke at Combat Jiu-Jitsu, got a ton of views against PJ Barch. But I'm talking about, what is the person coming into Jiu-Jitsu seeing as their path to success? And I don't think they're necessarily seeing Combat Jiu-Jitsu. And the whole point of all that is that because of that, I don't think these promoters want to go through all the trouble of dealing with the athletic commission and maybe paying a lot of money to put on a sport that people aren't necessarily jumping at the bit to get involved in. And so now the question comes up, is CJJ just a novelty, or does it stand alone as a sport? I truly do believe that CJJ can stand alone as a sport. That might not be a super popular opinion, but I'm just a big fan of Combat Jiu Jitsu. I think it's a great sport. I think it's a great merging of two of my favorite combat sports, being MMA and submission grappling. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you are interested in Combat Jiu Jitsu and you're watching this video when it comes out, you are in luck, because in a couple weeks, December 11th through the 15th, Eddie Bravo's putting on what he's calling Jiu Jitsu Overdose, and I promise you, Eddie is not paying me to say this, even though this next part's going to sound like an ad. But Eddie, same offer I gave to Craig during CJI season. I can be bought. But seriously, December 13th is going to be the next Medusa. That is, as I mentioned before, an all-women's Combat Jiu Jitsu tournament, and that is going to feature the strawweights and the featherweights. And on December 15th is going to be Combat Jiu Jitsu Worlds. This time around, it is the lightweights. If you guys watch that, please make sure you keep an eye out for Matt Mash. He is this young phenom. If you guys didn't see it in the CJJ tournament, earlier in the year, he took second place. The kid had 3 submissions in his 3 wins, and obviously lost in the finals. But that dude, if you guys are a fan of high pace, high action jiu-jitsu, watch him. I also point out Matt because I personally think Matt's game is the evolution of combat jiu-jitsu. Watch how he implements the palm strikes. He doesn't just play like an MMA fighter. He doesn't just play like a jiu-jitsu guy. He plays really well in the middle. And on that, if you guys are enjoying this style of video, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. That lets me know that I'm making the type of videos that you want to see. Other than that, I am going to sign off. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.